Councillor Casey, question?
Yeah, it's just that if we are informing the public about what's in the plan for them, are we going to demystify it a little bit by decoding it a little?
We can certainly do our best about that.
I think we need to.
Yeah, I guess the presumption is plans have plenty sort of language, but somewhere there needs to be something that actually explains what this does. Good call. Okay, right, next time.
Okay, vehicle access restrictions. So there are some rules in the notified plan that restrict your access to a development site and put it through a resource consent assessment. So they or they specify minimum widths of things like vehicle crossings. The vehicle access is not permitted, i.e. it's non-complying in the city centre zone on specified key retail frontages. So within the city centre here, there are streets that have been mapped where it's a non-complying activity to provide a vehicle crossing. Queen Street would be a classic example. So there are rules in the unitary plan that say if you're developing an office building or retail mixed use on Queen Street, then a vehicle crossing is a non-complying activity. Vehicle access requires restricted discretionary activity on specified motorway interchanges to avoid conflicts with motorway on and off ramps, and also level crossings and certain arterial roads. They're mapped in the notified plan, areas where if you want to have a vehicle crossing, you would need to obtain a resource consent. And there's a general rule there, the last bullet point, under the notified PORP, vehicle access requires restricted discretionary consent within 10 metres of intersections. Submitters' views, use of vehicle crossings subject to these restrictions should be, or existing vehicle crossings should be permitted. So if someone already has a vehicle crossing, if they want to intensify the development on their site, we had submitters saying that that should be allowed, the crossing is already there, but in the notified plan, if you were intensifying a development, then you would you would trigger the need for resource consent. So submitters are asking for that to change. The rule about level crossings should be, a new rule should be introduced controlling new level crossings put in place by Kiwi Rail, and the state highway access rule should be deleted. So that was where the submitters were coming from in terms of restricting vehicle access to sites. Council's position at the hearing again was largely to retain the approach. There was an amendment proposed to recognise the use of existing crossings, which Kevin can speak to if you want more detail on that one. And the state highway related vehicle crossing and access rule was proposed to be deleted. I might have to hand over to Kevin to explain those two as well.
Okay, in terms of the amendments to the vehicle access restrictions, as noted in the submitters' feedback, they were seeking that existing vehicle access points be recognised. So we did do that as part of the amendments through the hearings mediation process. So that's essentially recognising existing use rights, and then we developed a framework for assessing other situations where the applicant was not going to increase the number of vehicle crossings where these building frontage controls applied. So for instance, if a applicant was coming in and they already had 2 vehicle crossings in place, and if they wanted to either consolidate or relocate those 2 crossings, and they were undertaking a development as part of that vehicle relocation or consolidation, then that would trigger the need for a consent for council and Auckland Transport to assess the impacts of that particular reconfiguration of the vehicle access crossing. So it was, I guess at the end of the day, it was a more refined approach to managing vehicle crossings rather than, I suppose it was more a blunt, black and white kind of rule which existed in the notified plan. So that's the essence of the change for the first bullet point. The second bullet point really represents NZTA recognising that the unitary plan had a bit of a process duplication, and to eliminate that duplication, it was a matter of deleting the requirements around vehicle access assessment by NZTA, because they already had a separate process under the Government Roading Powers Act to assess any new vehicle access or crossing which affected their network. So Obviously, if that's simplified and reduced the content in the plan, then we were happy to accept that. And they still had a mechanism to assess the impacts on their network.
All right, so the next topic relates back to the four themes that I discussed in the RPS, and this is the one around transport-related noise and managing the adverse effects of transport, and also managing the effects of development next to transport routes on the use of transport networks. So in the notified plan, there was an overlay called the High Land Transport Noise Overlay, and what it did was it required new activities or additions to existing activities, e.g. bedrooms or classrooms sensitive to noise and located within the overlay, to be designed to comply with minimum specified internal noise levels. So essentially acoustic treatment of any new development in close proximity to high transport routes. And the trigger for that was the next bullet point. It's, if you were, within 40 metres of either side of roads carrying over 20,000 vehicles per day, existing or predicted future volumes, and rail corridors with more than 12 nighttime and 6 daytime train movements. So if you're in that sort of corridor, then in order to avoid getting a resource consent, you would have to have an acoustic treatment to get a certain internal noise level for habitable rooms. Submitters' views: retain, remove, reduce or increase extent of the overlay, provide compensation for people in this overlay if they're having to do noise mitigation as part of a new development, and amendments proposed to the wording of the objectives and policies and rules. Council's position was to retain the overlay, not to delete it, and the refinements were to increase the maximum internal noise level for bedrooms and sleeping areas during the daytime. So there was a technical change there to just allow for a higher level of internal noise at daytime, and extend the overlay to 80 metres where it was adjacent to the state highway or motorway network where there are more than 70,000 vehicles per day. So based on some acoustic modelling, noise modelling, the 40 metres was, I guess, demonstrated to be insufficient where you're getting up to volumes of 70,000 vehicles per day, and next to the rail corridors as well. And increase of the application of the rule to include things like care centres, childcare centres, for example. Questions on the overlay?
Okay, Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, John, does that include extensive renovations or someone going from a single house putting in a terraced house sort of position? Does new cover that definition?
That's my understanding it would. Yeah.
Thanks.
So it's not forcing anyone to do any acoustic treatment of their existing house, but once you're starting to add bedrooms or redevelop, then you would. Okay. Right, moving on to the strategic transport corridor zone. So roads in the unitary plan are generally just shown as a road. They're not zoned business, residential, transport road. They have their own specific set of rules in the unitary plan, but for the strategic transport corridor zone we do have a zone, and that covers the state highway network and the rail network. It provides for a wide range of transport activities, cycleways, park and ride and so on. It provides for an integrated transport system and interim or short-term non-transport activities, which is the key point. The zone allows for more than the designations that apply on the motorway network and the rail network would typically allow for, and that's just to provide for some interim use of bits of land that are not currently being used as road that may be used in the future, but there's still some uncertainty around that. So the designation will remain the main primary means of managing, operating the rail network and the state highway network. So they've got the benefit of a designation, which essentially overrides the unitary plan, but this strategic transport corridor zone was developed to just allow a little bit more flexibility for bits and pieces of land here and there within the designation that might not be critical to transport at this point in time. Submitters' views provide for bus stops in the strategic transport corridor zone. So that was, sorry, bus depots, and provide for interim non-transport activities. They should have the same activity status as the zone adjoining them. So if residential is permitted next to the rail corridor, then if there's some land surplus to requirements for now within the rail corridor, then residential should have the same activity status. Obviously there's the noise issues to deal with, but probably not the best activity to pick, but that's an example of what the submitters were asking for there. The council's position was to retain the notified approach, but amendments to provide for bus depots in the strategic transport corridor zone, and amendments to provide for interim non-transport activities on the same basis as adjoining zones. So in the notified plan, there were certain non-transport activities that had a specific status in the zone, and council moved towards accepting that that status should be aligned to the residential, business or rural zone that happens to be right next to the zone, the transport corridor zone. Questions on? Okay, and last but not least, the rail corridor safety. So in the notified plan, there were no rules dealing with rail corridor safety. Submitters, so this was Kiwi Rail essentially, predominantly, were asking for a safe clearance between activities on land adjacent to the rail network and the introduction of a 4-metre yard setback in all zones to provide for electrical safety. So the concern there is with the electrification of the rail network, situations where you might have an apartment building with balconies right hard up against the rail corridor. That was seen as a big concern for Kiwi Rail. So council's position at the hearing was a rule that applies across the whole of Auckland, so it's not customised to any zone, and that required any buildings or structures within 2.5 metres of the rail corridor to be set back 2.5 metres. So a bit of a compromise there, and I think Kiwi Rail were comfortable in the end with 2.5.
They were comfortable with that, yeah, and it just basically provides council with an opportunity to make that assessment should there be a building within that particular buffer from the rail corridor.
And those apartments at Onehunga, they must be the closest.
That's one example that was highlighted.
Okay, and that's it for transport, with the reference to where the council's evidence and the evidence of submitters is on the panel website, topics 43 and 44.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, just welcome Suki Singh, who's our one of our leads on infrastructure, and we'll start again with the regional policy statement, approach to infrastructure and energy, and we'll also touch on the notified plan. There was a real focus on what we called significant infrastructure at the regional policy statement level, and that included the transport, electricity, water, wastewater, telecoms, and ports, and the airports. A lot of reference to protecting significant infrastructure from reverse sensitivity, so more sensitive activities next to infrastructure causing problems for the operation of the infrastructure itself. The RPS recognised the locational function-based requirements of significant infrastructure and its need to be located in certain places, so some recognition that significant infrastructure cannot always avoid being in the coastal management area and the coastal marine area, cannot always avoid being in some of the overlay areas such as significant ecological overlays. Things like water reservoirs and transmission lines often cross or are located within some of the unitary plan overlays. And there was guidance in the RPS on managing the effects of new or major upgrades on things like significant ecological areas or outstanding natural landscapes. Council's position at the hearings was to support the overall approach in the notified plan. The definition of significant infrastructure was proposed to be extended to include all of the network or parts of the network, not just the core elements, and amendments to the policy framework for reverse sensitivity effects on infrastructure, requiring new sensitive activities to avoid in the first instance, and in the second instance, remedy or mitigate if that's not practicable. So that was the regional policy statement. We had some interim guidance from the panel on infrastructure, and the panel felt, so this was February last year, having heard submissions on the regional policy statement, that there should be a standalone section for infrastructure. So infrastructure issues were incorporated in, I think, the economic wellbeing section of the regional policy statement. So they felt, having listened to submitters such as the Auckland Utility Operators Group, that infrastructure should have a standalone chapter in the RPS.